English translation, 718th contact. Part 1, Monday the 8th of April 2019, 20:07 hours.
Greetings, Eduard, dear friend.
You are here once again at an early hour, dear friend, but be welcome and greeted as usual. What drives you to come at this hour already?
There is something to be discussed for once that is of necessity and should no longer be postponed nor kept quiet.
I am anxious to hear about that. But if I may, I would have something to ask first that would be of interest to our group members, if that is all right with you.
Of course, go ahead and ask.
Every now and then I am asked how I can call up our conversation reports, for which I myself only know that the small control disk is decisive, which you have fixed. I do not know how high above the Earth in a stationary position above the center.
That is correct, but to explain all the processes and procedures involved would be going too far. So I will only deal with it briefly. Our conversations, which the two of us often have together, are transmitted directly to our station during our conversation and stored there. Look here. All of us who have conversations with you carry this little device with us that records every word spoken by you and by us, and transmits it directly to our station, where on the one hand it is stored, but then it is forwarded to the little control device where you can then retrieve everything. Now this required a lot of work in the last few years, which Yanarara and Zafanat Paneach had to carry out when we discovered that serious disturbances were occurring which we could not understand, but which we were able to eliminate by means of new constructions, but this took years. Only when it was realized that external influences were causing the disturbances could research be undertaken, and new devices, etc., created and tested until finally the disturbing influences could be eliminated. However, it was only recently that it was possible to secure everything in such a way that no more disturbances could take effect, since Zafanat Paneach and Yanarara were able to find out which energies caused all the disturbances. Through the latest findings, it became possible to straighten everything out so that the whole transmission process can now take place without interference, because the maliciously interfering sectarian influences had to be eliminated, which, however, still have a detrimental effect on your work, etc., in your working space. Unfortunately, however, at present, everything is connected with a reduction in the speed of retrieval, which is why you need several times the time today to retrieve the conversations and write them down. Of course, all the recordings of our conversations are also transferred to ERA and archived by us.
Then I imagined the whole thing wrong, because I thought that everything goes directly to ERA in each case, and then from there back to the little control disk where I can just retrieve it.
That was indeed a misconception.
But that is not a bad thing. Besides, I have never asked about it before, but only now because I was asked about it. But now I have another question regarding the many sightings of unknown flying objects around the world, which have been observed again and again for centuries. This was particularly the case in the last century, as well as in the new millennium, but I must not forget the Foo Fighters during the last World War, nor the objects that we have been able to observe here in the center over all these years, and also at the present time, but which were not from you. The question is whether you Pleiaren ever had anything to do with all the other objects that have been observed again and again around the world. I am thinking particularly of the objects that were observed in the USA, in South America, throughout Europe, and specifically the triangular objects that became known in Belgium, but also in 1976 in Persia, where the military pilot Jafari Parvich, and in 1984 or so in Peru, the military pilot Oscar Santa Maria chased after the objects.
No, we Pleiaren never had anything to do with it, because without exception these flying apparatuses observed everywhere, called UFOs by Earth humans, did not belong to us, but to the aliens who have been working on Earth since time immemorial. If we could be observed and photographed, then we deliberately allowed this to happen only to members of your groups or to persons who were friends of yours, while we specially commissioned you to take pictures and films of our flying apparatus. In doing so, We were also always careful that the strangers could not gain any knowledge of this and make absolutely no observations, because we did not want to give any encouragement for them, as we do not now and will not in the future, to record our presence, because we do not want to endanger our homeland, and therefore we are not allowed to make any contact with the strangers. Establishing contact with any strangers always means insecurity and danger, even if a good relationship is established under certain circumstances. Because all life forms are susceptible to overt or subterranean indoctrination, as a result of which a great deal of harm can come about. Under certain circumstances, connections can also result from contacts that can lead to attacks, conquests, and wars, which is why our directives forbid us to make contact with the aliens working here on Earth or even to make ourselves recognizable to them. If we were to make ourselves recognizable to them in any way, then on the one hand we would violate our directives. On the other hand, we would run the risk of betraying our space-time structure and thus also our homeland, and in addition, under certain circumstances, we would relapse into the old behavioral patterns of our early ancestors due to the influences of the strangers. We Pleiaren are also human beings, and still burdened in our deepest character with unpleasant impulses, even though we have been making great efforts for more than 52,000 years to work them out and to dissolve them. But this takes a very long time and always means that there is a danger that through indoctrinating influences of other mentalities, in one case or another relapses into the old patterns of behavior could occur. This is fundamentally the fact of our strict restraint in every respect towards foreigners. What you asked about the flying objects of all kinds and sizes of the aliens, which have been observed by Earth humans again and again for centuries, even in the present time, and also by you in the center and by members of the association everywhere, that therefore never had and never has anything to do with us Pleiaren, because we have no connection whatsoever with the aliens. It is true that they have a very high level of technology, but it cannot be compared with ours and is still very much in need of development. This does not mean, however, that their mentality is also at a higher level of development, which, according to our long-term research, is not the case either. In the end, it must be said once again that all observations of unknown flying objects, etc., since all times, as is also the case at the present new time, can only be traced back to the strangers with whom we have no contact whatsoever and who are also unable to perceive our existence and presence. Our highly developed technology denies them any possibility of being able to locate us in any way or perceive us in any other way.
I know that, and I guess it is good that you have brought these things out in the open, so they are also put in writing for once. Might be interesting if the strangers called me once, which I do not think they will, though I would not be a danger to them and would also keep quiet about it if I had to.
It could certainly be interesting, though we Pleiaren would have to stay out of it in every respect. I wouldn't have any qualms for you either, because you don't have the same big problems as us Pleiaren in terms of the danger of reversion, because you are in with my father.
Please do not, because that does not belong here and shouldn't be said officially. But of course I think that these strangers will not let themselves be seen with me, even if it would be interesting. I could imagine, though, that for some reason the bulks might shy away from it and be afraid in terms of their safety.
Which would be completely illusory if you were contacted, though.
There would be no reason for me to play false after all. Now, what is the reason for your coming so early today, my friend?
Today we have to talk about why it happened that in your living room you unexpectedly met your then-wife Calliope and we came face to face. That, as well as other necessities to be discussed, which we have also never talked about in detail and openly, but I feel that I must bring up the whole thing from my point of view once, and also release my knowledge, which I had endeavored to obtain concerning Calliope and had thereby recognized frightening unpleasantness. And I also think that it will be necessary for you to also call up and write down what I have to say. so that your adversaries, etc., will also understand what corresponds to reality and truth, contrary to the lies and slander of your ex-wife. This also includes certain underhandedness, dishonest actions, and mission damaging, as well as dangerous deeds and behavior directed against your physical and mental health and safety, too.
Excuse me, but I do not think this should be brought up openly. Because on the one hand, I would like to say that everything is a private matter that does not belong in the public domain, and on the other hand, I am not vindictive, so I am not eager to mess up my ex. Unfortunately, the opposite is true of her, as well as her favorite son, both of whom have joined forces with antagonistic figures. On the one hand, as a result of their evil, unfounded hatred and primitive reasons for revenge, and on the other hand, because they are weak in terms of intellect, reason, and intelligentum, and are also uneducated and stupid. So I am vilified by both of them through lies and slanders on the internet and in newspapers and magazines, whereby the stupid elements, who think they are big and clever, open the ways for them to reach the public worldwide with their lies and slanders, be it through radio, television, newspapers and magazines, or through any of their vituperations, which are otherwise spread by both of them and their pathologically stupid ones and those who run with and listen to their lies and slanders. But when I speak of stupid people and their stupidity, then it is necessary that I explain once according to your Pleiadian teachings, as I learned them from your father's Thoth already in the 1940s, what stupidity basically is and as what and how it must be defined. And this corresponds to something completely different from what our earthly psychologists, philosophers and scientists, etc., explain and claim, who have no idea and understanding in this respect, and therefore do not know what stupidity is based on at all. However, many of those I have mentioned, namely psychologists, philosophers and scientists, etc., will reject this in their narrow-mindedness and know-it-all attitude and will not acknowledge it, but will deny it and insult it, because they themselves are addicted to stupidity in their specialist knowledge. This is because they have no realization and no effective knowledge of what stupidity actually refers to, namely that it is simply based on the fact that in a certain field, such as psychology, philosophy, the sciences, etc., the necessary requirements of education, development, experiencing, and learning are insufficient or completely lacking in relation to the intellect, reason, and intelligentum. And the consequence of this is that no truthful fathoming of the psyche of a human being can take place, but misjudgments are made, causing immense damage and even evil mischief, up to and including murder, for which the misjudgment of psychology, philosophy, and the sciences, etc., would actually have to take responsibility. Stupidity is something different from how psychology and philosophy, etc., explain and judge it, because stupidity has nothing to do with the fact that human beings are subject to a disease of consciousness falsely called mental illness, a stupidity or limitation of consciousness falsely called spirit, or any form of inability to make decisions, to form opinions, to behave, and to act, just as they are not subject to an inability to think, to train, to reflect. Even a human being addicted to stupidity is absolutely capable of turning to certain fields of knowledge, professions and activities and all kinds of development-related things, of learning everything imaginable in a good way, as well as of being creative and also of achieving great things in all kinds of fields, such as technology of all kinds of sciences, lifestyle, electronics, digital technology, natural history, biology, astronomy, etc., and so on, to achieve great things. As a rule, a human being addicted to stupidity is absolutely normal in the sense of the human sane norm of consciousness, as a result of which he or she is as a rule normal in terms of consciousness wrongly called mentally normal. This is just how the general human opinion imagines it with regard to a normal relationship concerning what is normal. Correct and usual according to the human normal state of consciousness is erroneously called state of mind. In this way, the term normal assumes that the function of consciousness erroneously called mental function of the human being corresponds to a healthy function, and thus is not subject to any abnormal damage, which would completely impair a conscious and clear use of consciousness and further development of consciousness. The term normal or normality is used and applied by the human beings of Earth ambiguously and quite naturally, but incomprehensibly, for this term is one that is so confused and ambiguous with regard to normal or normality that disputes not infrequently arise over it. The very question of whether a human being with a disability of consciousness, wrongly called mental handicap, is normal or not, is viewed and judged differently by different human beings. So on the one hand, the opinion can be that such a disability is not normal, while on the other hand, other opinions amount to a disorder, illness, or something else, because the concept of normal is interpreted very differently as a result of different ways of thinking, views, and understanding. Thus, it can be argued that a disability is not normal because being normal is considered a biological norm, while on the other hand, a disability is considered completely normal because it is life-related or occurs only in relatively small numbers, etc. Depending on the human beings and their way of looking at and understanding things, the assessment therefore differs. Thus, on the one hand, the opinion can be held that a disability is completely normal because it can correspond to a natural form of existence, while on the other hand, for a person who himself has a disability, this belongs to his personal normality, and he is also of this opinion. This explanation clearly shows that there is not only one definition of normal and normality, but also different ones, because the term normal can be interpreted in completely different ways and according to the corresponding opinion. What is related to stupidity with regard to the normal, the norm, has nothing to do with doubting the sanity of human beings, for with regard to stupidity, which is what is being spoken of, in what has been said and in what follows, the normality, the norm, that is to say the normal being of human consciousness is wrongly called spirit, is not attacked and not doubted. With regard to stupidity as a whole, it is also to be said that a human being can be addicted specifically to a certain thing, as well as generally to anything and everything, whereby this knows no limits in any case, because contrary to the professional claims of psychology and various sciences, etc., this does not show any impairment of consciousness and also has nothing to do with the fact that IQ would be impaired by this. This corresponds to complete nonsense, because the intelligentum cannot be tested and evaluated in any way, but solely and exclusively nothing other than the processed, learned, and memorized knowledge and the associated combination moment of the human being, which is generally called intelligence. This intelligence, it must be repeatedly explained, corresponds only to a learned and memory-stored knowledge, which, however, has absolutely nothing to do with the intellect, and thus also nothing to do with intelligentum or being intelligent. Intelligentum and intelligence have no connection whatsoever, and correspond to completely different values. But this is absolutely unknown as a result of the ignorance in this respect in the very faulty earthly psychology teachings, psychology studies, and consequently in psychology knowledge as a whole. And this has resulted for a very long time in intelligence being equated with intellect, and intelligentum with being intelligent. Intelligence, it must be explained once again, corresponds only to a learned and memory-stored knowledge, a knowledge that is called school knowledge, general knowledge, professional knowledge, factual knowledge, departmental knowledge, mission knowledge, activity knowledge and milieu knowledge, obligation knowledge as well as sphere of activity knowledge, vocation knowledge, commitment knowledge, work sphere knowledge, position knowledge and métier knowledge, etc., and is thus broadly encompassing. This, however, has in no way anything to do with intelligentum, that is to say being intelligent, because intelligence corresponds solely to the knowledge and combination moment and the knowledge memory of human beings, as well as that through these certain knowledge values are brought together, or the resulting connections are perceived and named, but cannot be evaluated and thus cannot be comprehended, because it is only a matter of knowledge information. Something completely different from intelligence or intelligence value, which is measured as IQ or the value of knowledge and the moment of combination, is the so-called intelligentum or being intelligent. This is because they embody the ability of human beings to think abstractly through understanding and reason, and to derive purposeful action from this. Consequently, intelligentum or being intelligent is not only a certain knowledge in relation to certain things and values that are expressed, as is the case with intelligence, But intelligentum, or being intelligent, is founded as the actual factor of the high value of logic or consistency in relation to the development of understanding and reason. And if intelligence is also always to be mentioned, practically as an inevitable consequence, then this factor is mentioned as the third value no more and no less, simply because it is a storehouse of knowledge in addition to the development of understanding and reason and all the resulting high values. In contrast to intelligence is intelligentum, or being intelligent through understanding and reason, which is an abstract ability to think and reason with a purposeful understanding and reasoning, intelligent thinking and cognition. And it is only through this intelligence that the formation of ideas and the processing of ideas, as well as actions in accordance with understanding and reason, and corresponding modes of behavior, etc., are made possible. And this alone without intelligence, which only forms the role of the collector and storehouse of knowledge, and has no capacity whatsoever for understanding and reason, and thus also no energy and power, as well as no influence on the development of an activity of thought, action, and behavior. An extremely high intelligence, that is to say, an extremely great knowledge in relation to a general knowledge, or any form of professional or specialist knowledge, etc., etc., does not in any way mean that the human being would also be highly developed in relation to his intellect, that is to say, his intelligentum, that is to say, his being intelligent. There is no high intelligence quotient that could be addressed as an effective value, except in relation to the stored knowledge, which, however, corresponds to no more than a memory value that can be retrieved and reproduced without any action. In the process, neither existential anxiety nor social isolation or emotional problems can occur, because intelligence as a pure store of knowledge is absolutely actionless and does not move anything out of itself. A computer process can serve as a comparison to this, when a search window is opened and a search question is entered, after which an answer window simply opens and the answer for the question is listed in writing in it, without any further and own activity taking place. In this process, no emotions are emitted, and therefore also no short or lasting dissatisfaction with regard to the question, but the aim of the question or the answer is simply given on the screen without emotion or activity. But this also leaves the effect of the answer to the person asking the question, so that he or she has to come to terms with, understand, and implement the value of the answer according to his or her own ability. And this arises in this way precisely because intelligence is not the same as intelligentum, or being intelligent, which achieves a high degree of education through every conscious learning and forms the mind-reason accumulation of knowledge, wisdom. In the process, all knowledge is then also transported into intelligence, but only as pure knowledge, which is stored and can be reproduced as such, but cannot be utilized and thus neither implemented nor exploited. The use, implementation, and utilization of all knowledge, ideas, developments and plans, etc., can only take place through the intellect and reason or through their predetermined functions, whereby these values cannot be measured in the way that is practiced with regard to the senseless and downright moronic intelligence quotient. By means of such a quotient, IQ scores and IQ scale are supposedly used to determine the extent to which human beings are gifted, and so on. Such an insane scale is, for example, the following, which is actually an insult to every human being who is rationally normal and thus not consciously impaired. Interpretation of IQ, that is to say, intelligence quotient. IQ percentage of the population. Uber, 130 equal sign 2.1 is a genius. 130 equal sign 2.1 is highly gifted. 121 130 equal sign 6.4 is gifted. 111 120 equal sign 15.7 is above average intelligence. 90 110 equal sign 51.6 is average intelligence. 80 89 equal sign 15.7 is below average intelligence. 70 79 equal sign 6.4 is mentally retarded. These imbecilic psychological evaluations have fundamentally nothing to do with the abilities and capacities in relation to the intellect and reason of human beings, but they are imbecilically simply related to the knowledge of intelligence, which is arranged absolutely under every use of abstract thinking. Reasoning, that is to say, the reason is that it is only through understanding and reason that knowledge and insight can be gained. And it is only the results of these that lead to a fine, sharp, and trained intellect or intelligentum or being intelligent. The fact is that stupidity in the human beings concerned appears as a lack of intellect, reason, and intelligentum, which also results in a lack of talent in the intellectual field. This is contrary to the sciences and psychology, which claim that neither intellect, reason, nor intelligentum are affected by stupidity. And since stupidity basically corresponds to nothing other than an underdevelopment or a non-development of understanding, reason and intelligentum to a certain extent in relation to a certain thing, or several of them, or in general, the whole thing is therefore very much a disadvantageous fact of understanding, reason and intelligentum. This then brings itself to bear as stupidity, which means, quite simply explained, that things and actions are done, behaviors are carried out, views and opinions are held, speeches are made, ideals are pursued, unreal stories of fantasy and lies are believed, and real reality and its truth are disregarded, etc., and thereby careless and uncontrollable mistakes are made which bring harm in some way. And all such thinking and acting, all such behavior, speech and opinions, as well as every belief of this kind, is precisely called stupidity, and this because learning with regard to controlling thoughts and feelings, as well as perception and recognition with regard to this, is impaired to the point of impossibility, and therefore it cannot be determined what corresponds to correctness or falsity. Hopes and desires or any false inspirations and imagined sensations also come into play, triggering wrong aspects of movements and ways of looking at things. And this is exactly what is being talked about in all the following explanations, in which especially the stupidity regarding the religious delusion of faith is in the foreground, which can only arise through the non-learning and non-development of the factor of perception of the real reality and its truth. And this delusion, which is far removed from all reality and truth and has since time immemorial brought discord, unfreedom, dissension, hatred and discontent to earth humans, is the all-embracing and most important factor in all the mischief that has been rampant in and over earth humans since time immemorial as a malignant delusion. This is because religious delusion disregards and tramples on the reality of creation and its laws and recommendations, commandments corresponding to recommendations. In fact, however, the creation of universal consciousness is absolutely real and thus also not bound up in a religious delusion of faith, as is the case with every religion and sect with regard to their imaginary and thus imagined and fantasized deity. The real creation, which is recognizable in the existence of the entire universe, of every celestial body and every planet, etc., and thus also in relation to the earth and its nature, fauna and flora, for every reasonable human being going through life with open eyes and senses, requires no religious or other delusional belief, but only the perception of its reality and its truth. This is because creation universal consciousness manifests itself recognizably in its truthful reality and its truth itself, as a visible, tangible, palpable universe with all its stars, nebulae, galaxies, planets, and nature with all its fauna and flora. The reason for this religious and sectarian delusion is founded in the fact that it has been hammered into the human beings for thousands of years through the indoctrination of delusional gurus, priests, cult leaders, and many other religious sectarian faith catchers through lies and deceit. This also results in a bondage to human beings and their lies, deceit, and slander, which are usually followed by foolish actions. These kinds of human beings live in ignorance and are weak existences in relation to a certain area, a thing, or also in general. And they have to struggle with their insufficient intelligentum, which they try to make up for by a smarmy or attacking, but also by an ingratiating, seductive, educated seeming, and many other kinds of behavior. As a rule, they do this by taking refuge in a delusion and occupying themselves privately or through a professional education with something or other, through which they can then pretend to be well-read and educated and believe that the fellow human beings with whom they surround themselves in their near and far surroundings are blind, stupid and dumb enough to believe their false educatedness and take it at face value. And this is also connected, on the one hand, to not taking their fellow human beings seriously, but on the other hand also to hold them down, to pester them and to take advantage of them in order to, paradoxically, indulge in and satisfy their own delusions of grandeur, but also to cowardly cover up their own lack of self-esteem and their very own personal rottenness, and to present themselves to the outside world as powerful, controlling, and domineering. The whole of the human being's stupidity corresponds to a dimension of stupidity that is emphasized in such a way that it inevitably becomes recognizable to a human being gifted with understanding, reason, and intelligence, as a result of which the stupid person cannot conceal his or her lack of consciousness, which the stupid person, however, is unable to realize because he or she mistakenly believes himself or herself to be educated and clever. It is therefore not without reason that it is said that there are also the stupid who cheat their way through life, and thus get far with the likewise stupid, because the latter are too stupid to recognize and understand the stupidity of the stupid. This is why very appropriate proverbs have also been invented, such as half the world belongs to the stupid, or the stupidest man may find the penny, but he does not see the gold piece next to it, and so on. In a narrower sense, stupidity also refers to the lack of ability to draw appropriate conclusions from perceptions and to learn intellectually intelligently. This deficiency is partly based on ignorance of all the necessary facts required to form a judgment, which the stupid human being, firstly, does not know a priori in his ignorance, and secondly, he is incapable of gaining real knowledge through an effective perception of reality and its truth. As a result, he is dependent on what he can absorb and pass on unthinkingly through his weak intellect, his lack of reason and intelligentum, because he is incapable of forming his own opinion through clear and tangible thoughts and reflections. This is precisely because the stupid human being in every respect cannot recognize any real perception of reality and its truth, and also cannot experience it, and consequently cannot gather any experience. Because logical thinking is not accessible to him purely with his intellect, reason, and intelligentum. Stupidity is therefore due to a deficient intellect as well as a lack of reason and intelligentum, although these factors could be built up if the stupid human being in question would make an effort to do so. Stupidity is, after all, as a rule, if it is not a matter of congenital damage to the consciousness that does not allow for clear thinking of one's own, a factor that is created by the human beings themselves and is therefore not congenital. Understanding, reason, intelligentum, knowledge and wisdom do not correspond in any way to a birth gift, for all these values must be laboriously learned and worked out by the human being himself from the ground up and thus from birth. This learning usually takes place through the upbringing and teachings of parents, siblings, relatives, and fellow human beings in the immediate and wider environment, as well as through the teaching staff of schools and vocational schools and personal self-education and self-education, etc., whereby the learning human being, depending on his or her own will, makes more or less effort to learn and thereby acquires knowledge and wisdom, and from this also understanding, reason, and intelligentum. This is contrary to the stupid assertions of ignorant psychologists, philosophers, and other know-it-alls, who on the one hand deny that understanding, reason, and intelligentum are learnable and can be further developed, but on the other hand also neither know the very far-reaching spiritual doctrine in terms of knowledge, nor can they understand and judge the human psyche. In contrast to the lack of judgment and understanding of all the far-reaching values in this respect, they have neither an effective idea of the whole nor an empathy with regard to the human world of thoughts, feelings, and psychology. Consequently, they cannot comprehend anything in this respect either. So these experts also cannot understand that the whole of stupidity or cleverness takes place solely through the efforts and interest of the individual human being, is learned, constantly expanded throughout life, and is aligned and expanded, or neglected, according to one's own interests, and that this varies from person to person as much as their opinions do. Today, understanding, reason, and intelligentum can be more appropriately compared to what distinguishes human beings from the sector of mechanics, and especially from electronic technology. Still, because at least at the present time, at the beginning of the 21st century, the third millennium, it is still superior to the entire development in this respect. And this is indeed still the case, even though billions of human beings have already become dependent on and addicted to the whole variety of mechanical and electronic technology, as for example with regard to poking around on smartphones or mobile phones with touchscreens and additional functions such as GPS, and the possibility of installing apps on them. And the fact that, partly as a result of this, millions and billions of human beings have become incapable of verbal communication with their peers and of interpersonal relationships, and have also become effectively effeminate creatures who can no longer do any physical work, who can no longer muster any initiative for their own thoughts, ideas, opinions, and actions, is only the beginning of the fact that an enormous number of these human beings are not only becoming increasingly stupid, lacking in understanding, reason, and intelligence, but are also becoming increasingly incapable of learning and are effectively slowly but surely becoming stupid. All these human beings are also losing all capacity for imagination, as well as the healthy power of conception, imagination and ingenuity with regard to valuable progress of every kind and form, etc., but they also lack the ability to think abstractly, as well as sensitivity and deeper sensibility, empathy, instinct, compassion, and the tactfulness of life. These human beings also lack good connecting qualities towards peace, freedom, justice, and righteousness, towards nature, its fauna and flora, and above all towards their fellow human beings. They also no longer show any recognizable measure of originality, creativity, and humor, but only a fanatical behavior with regard to various sports, which, however, due to their own incompetence and cowardice, they do not perform themselves, but let others do so, whom they cheer frenetically for their victory or shout at them with shame and disgrace when they lose and perform badly. Basically, it can be said that stupid human beings, nowadays mainly juveniles, but also many children, although older adults are also becoming increasingly stupid themselves, not only lack the ability to perceive clearly and recognize the truth, but also the necessary connection with nature and its fauna and flora. Consequently, it can be seen and recognized in them that they do not understand anything about life and every correct way of living, as well as about personal development in every necessary respect, are far removed from it, and consequently also do not make any effort to perceive the effectiveness of reality and its truth. So they also do not perceive that the atmosphere and the climate have been destroyed by much more, and continue to be destroyed irresponsibly than is officially known through the public media. However, they are so poor in their mentality and behavior as well as in their thoughts and feelings that they cannot think their way into reality and the truth of life with their inferior and false sensibility, and cannot cope with their life, which is characterized by stupidity, so that they finally decay as life failures completely in terms of thoughts, feelings, and psychology, and finally put an end to their own lives. This, while they show no consideration, helpfulness or tolerance towards their fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, the climate or the planet Earth itself, and show only indifference and harm towards everything. The whole mentality and behavior of the majority of the human beings on Earth corresponds to a formula for lack of understanding, reason and intelligence in the highest degree, and everything in this respect reveals the roaring stupidity of these human beings, as well as the fact that they are addicted to a religious delusion of faith, which subliminally incites them to a behavior of domination and power, and urges and often even forces them to be arrogant towards other religious believers and those who think differently. And this fact, which prevails subconsciously and unconsciously for the believers in the whole world of religious belief, forces them on every wanted or unwanted occasion to harbor, on the one hand, an enmity and domination towards those who believe and think differently, which is usually also accompanied, under certain circumstances, by violence and bloody revenge as well as murder. On the other hand, the whole of the manifold evil, which is buried deep in the innermost character being, constantly lurking insidiously in order to be able to burst forth and rage at every possible opportunity, is not fought and not dissolved, because it is simply disregarded and suppressed by the religious sectarian delusion of faith and the delusion of wanting to be better than the others. Thus it is given that all the malignant degenerations lurking in the deepest character being, which have 1,000 different forms, are a constant threat to the human being arising from it. And these innermost evil, malicious, mean, ugly, insidious, and deceitful attitudes are. If they break through to the outside through any thought-feeling psychic movements, which often needs very little, as when, proverbially speaking, a louse creeps over the human being's liver, dangerous, life-threatening, and correspond to a malignancy, or a malignancy which corresponds to an effective rule, which has the characteristics of a disease syndrome. So then, when the innermost degenerations in the deepest character break through to the outside, the possibility arises of a dangerous excitement, which normally degenerates into verbal malignancies or into physical violence. And such outbursts occur for all kinds of reasons, whether it is an insult or a fisticuff, a quarrel, war, hunger, pain, or anything else, because through some minor or also through serious thought-feeling psychic movements, the malignancy lurking insidiously in the deepest innermost character being breaks through to the outside. And when it breaks out, it is expressed verbally in an attacking and evil manner, or it degenerates into the worst kind of violence. So if any agitation arises, whether from thoughtless or attacking words, quarrel, war, hunger, pain, or anything else, then the malignancy lurking insidiously deep in the innermost character breaks through and becomes outwardly verbally blasphemous and attacking, or in the worst way with malignant hatred, with revenge and retaliation, and with evil physical violence, up to frenzy and murder, manslaughter, torture, mass murder, rape and massacre, etc., whereby no limits are set in this respect. If the facts stated so far, which correspond to the real reality and truth, are taken as a basis by the earthlings who pretend to be experts in psychology and psychiatry, and believe that they have eaten their psychological and psychiatric wisdom with shovel diggers, then they have understood nothing of the whole of psychology and psychiatry, and have no idea whatsoever of the whole of this reality and truth, let alone even a hint of knowledge. This is because through their academic studies they only study hypotheticals or assumptions and presumptions, but not the effectively real facts that correspond to reality and truth, as these are conveyed by the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, about which these specialists are absolutely ignorant. If, however, they were to become knowledgeable of the teaching which deals with all conceivable facts concerning the existence and life of human beings, and teaches all that which is not taught in any college or university, however important, then they would become real specialists. And if the majority of human beings on Earth, who are dozing off in religious delusion and consequently also in stupidity, would also learn this teaching consciously, willingly, and with interest, then humanity would progress very quickly in its inner development and would also not have any destructive effects on nature. Its fauna and flora, waters, seas, forests, floodplains and meadows, the atmosphere, the climate, and on the planet itself. All the terrible destructions and ruination as well as the annihilation and extinction, as this happens through the machinations of the overflowing Earth humans with regard to nature and its fauna and flora, are not only related to the climate, but they are so manifold that it is impossible for me to list everything, because this would fill an entire book. But the fact is that the entire planet, its nature, the entire plant and animal world, as well as the insect, amphibian, reptile, fish and bird world, as well as all other life on Earth, which also includes the human beings, is already tremendously poisoned and will continue to be poisoned. So that at the end of the second decade of the third millennium, there is effectively nothing left that is not more or less affected by all kinds of toxins. And this is so along with all the other evils that have been causing mischief for decades, like the whole of the catastrophic in relation to climate change, which is degenerating into a climate crash. As Svath already said, and I got to many media worldwide with my predictions in the 1940s and 1950s, but was ridiculed for it, as I have been again and again since 1975 up to the present day, if it was even mentioned at all. So it is not just climate change, because the whole of nature with its fauna and flora has been suffering for a long time and continues to be harassed, as have the fresh waters, oceans, and all their creatures, in addition to mankind, which is itself responsible for all destruction, annihilation, and extinction. And this is also the case with regard to the dissolution of the permafrost, whereby mountains collapse or become a great danger through demolition, whereby the atmosphere is also affected by methane gases being released, and everything will become much worse than the responsible narrow-minded scientists are still falsely claiming at the present time. The entire reality of the present conditions of the planet Earth, of nature and of the entire fauna and flora, etc., is on the one hand quite obviously not recognized and misunderstood by the responsible sciences, while on the other hand, however, also deliberately false results of the acquired knowledge are disseminated to the public. This is also the case with regard to official, Secret Service, military and air traffic disclosure lists concerning observed unknown flying objects or UFOs worldwide, because in total only about 10% have been disclosed to the public to date. This would be the case if human beings would begin to think and reflect in an effectively rational and intelligent way and find the reality and truth of life in all existence, and would also become clear and aware of their very far-reaching responsibility. They would also no longer have a ruinous, destructive, and self-deluding effect on their own personal consciousness, and equally no longer have a damaging effect on their own total organism, which includes the thought-feeling psychic world and also the entire material body. All this, however, is neglected and nullified by the stupidity of the individual human being, and thus also by the majority of humanity, because the individual does not consciously turn to correct thinking and does not make sufficient effort to build up his intellect, his reason and his intelligentum, as well as his general knowledge and wisdom. On the whole, he does not pay attention to all the necessities connected with this, whereby the religious delusion of faith particularly prevents him from doing so. The latter indoctrinates him into believing that as a human being he should not think for himself, should not form his own opinion, and should not act according to his own decisions, but that he must and may only do according to God's will, which on the one hand is dictated to him by his delusion, and on the other, that he only has to follow what religious and sect gurus, religious bigwigs, priests, clergymen, preachers, and other unclergymen indoctrinate him with, but from which he can hardly, or not at all, free himself by following the whole religious-believing nonsense unthinkingly and obediently. And the fact is that every religious belief creates hatred, discord, death, wars, murder, destruction, and ruin, also today and tomorrow, as it has been since time immemorial. And today this hatred, especially religion-related, is getting out of hand again and will lead to renewed mischief in the future, not only between Christians and Muslims, but also between Christians and Jews, with neo-Nazis in particular being and continuing to be the driving forces, as well as so-called normal Christians who, through indoctrination by neo-Nazis and Reich Germans, are becoming haters of Jews, just as Jews and Muslims, on the other hand, are becoming haters of Christians and haters of Germany. And in doing so, all of these haters will insult their opponents, that is to say the Christians, the Jews, and Muslims, and the Muslims and Jews the Christians, as bad human beings, and in their hatred will give satisfaction by murder and manslaughter, as has been the custom since time immemorial. And this will happen as it has always done, out of sheer idiocy, out of imbecility and nonsensical old and new hatred, which arises out of stupid racism and religious delusion and divides human beings into good and bad. Because religious delusion has pretended this since time immemorial, although the opposite is mendaciously preached. And this is so even though there is no good or bad human being, but only human beings who have good or bad character traits which they express, and which are objected to or praised by other human beings. To think with reason, rationality and intelligentum is not possible for any religiously delusional human being, because if he has fallen prey to a religious delusion of faith, then this prevents him from thinking neutrally and independently of faith, because religious faith holds him captive, and makes it impossible for him to think even a single thought that would be without the influence of faith. And in this it is the rule that the human being who is afflicted by a delusion of faith that dominates him and is dominated by it, which is inevitably the case with every believer in religion, sect, or any other kind of faith, does not, however, realize it. And this happens because the delusional faith works completely meanly unconsciously, and in this respect, suppresses and completely switches off the necessary intellect as well as reason and intelligentum in every believing human being. whereby these values have just remained unnoticed in the specific formation and development of intellect, reason, and intelligentum, and have therefore also atrophied. Therefore, it can also not be recognized and understood, because it is completely illogical. Because illogic does not occur in the whole of creation and in all of its created existences, that if there were effectively a God or a creator God, there would be no God. Creator God, as the various religions and sects claim, whereby each individual religion and sect claims its own God and also names him differently, he would not be so stupid and imbecilic that he would create various religions, sects, and faiths, and despite the diversity of languages, would allow himself to be named differently than with a uniform name. It would be logical alone that only one religion with only one denomination would exist, which, moreover, would be oriented towards a single doctrine, which alone would be oriented towards the effectively recognizable, visible, and tangible reality and its truth, which can be comprehended by reason, and intelligentum. This alone would result in clear recognition, understanding, and knowledge, as well as an equally clear comprehension of all visible existence in nature, fauna, flora, and in the creation-given universe and all their reality and existential truth, and this uniformly and undoubtedly as an incontrovertible correspondence with reality. Such a faith would be oriented and recognizable for every life form in such a way that the whole could be consciously grasped, understood, implemented, and effectively utilized. However, such a religion and belief system prescribed by a God does not exist, has never existed, and will also never exist. Every religious delusion of any kind is defended absolutely vehemently in every case, one way or another, when it is brought into the field in any way. And this happens because every religious or other delusion of faith works underground in such a way that it eliminates everything that corresponds to a rational, and intelligent thought. In this way, the delusion of faith is superior to every clear, rational, and intelligent thought, and this is because the delusion of faith has a mean, subterranean, and unconsciously compelling effect on the believing human being and holds him captive, as a result of which he cannot himself ascertain it in any way, which is why he defends his delusion. He cannot fathom this because with his unclear, unneutral delusion, he cannot come to terms with reality and truth, precisely because it is bound up with his faith. Consequently, there is not a single human being who believes in religion and whose intellect, reason, and intelligentum would be above making thoughts and reflections about the effective real reality and its truth in a completely neutral and faith-free way, in order to also perceive the effective reality and its truth with reason, intellect, and intelligentum, to be able to understand and comprehend it. No religiously believing human being is capable of this, even if he has enjoyed a good school education, a higher education or university education, and has earned a doctorate or professorial title, because the deepest-seated delusion of faith prevents any healthy, free, neutral as well as reality and truth, moderate perception and understanding. Consequently, the only correct, true, and real of reality and its truth cannot be recognized and accepted in any way. Every religious, sectarian, or other belief prevents this through the forcibly acting delusion, which suppresses and stifles all understanding and every hint of reason and intelligentum, as a result of which the human being cannot attain understanding, reason, and intelligentum, and therefore continues to go through life in stupidity. Yet this term stupidity, as explained by the Pleiadian scribes and linguists, which I once asked for and which I have written down here, today means something quite different from what today's end product stupidity says. The original word from the Old German was tuomanu and meant undignified, but in the course of time this term was quaffed by the language changes to the abbreviation taum, and further to tum, tuam and tum, and then to tump, and from this again to stumpf, dumpf, and dumb, which finally gave rise to the dumbheit in use today. This term stupidity, whose primordial origin meant tuomanu, that is to say undignified, was early on understood by the form tum as dull, and then as dullness, through the changes in language, and was increasingly given special meanings. This gave rise to a word value that could be expressed by a series of words of the same or similar meaning. These being related in meaning and therefore in a particular context, in relation to the greater or lesser degree of the absence of understanding, reason, and intelligentum. These word values have expanded over time, as has also the original term tuamanu, which is used today as stupidity. However, the meanings that have emerged from the original term since time immemorial, and which are still expanding today and will certainly do so in the future, encompass a whole range of meanings, such as staid, indifferent, blindly believing, simple-minded, guileless, superficial, incomprehensible, unconcerned, backwoods, naive, senseless, limited, crazy, confused, stupid, dim-witted, moronic, stupid, uncomprehending, and underexposed. And further, the following meanings are also in circulation, such as inane, foolish, unreliable, clueless, stupid, empty-headed, dumbed down, nonsensical, without sense, futile endeavor, unrighteous, insincere, unimaginative, stultified, galloping spoof, equal sign standing on the sidelines, inadequate, gullible and unthinking, etc. Well, the fact is that only a human being who is free from religion, sectarianism, or other beliefs is able to think, consider, judge, and communicate in a healthy, clear, and neutral way in relation to real reality and its truth in every righteous, good, and progressive, as well as logical or consistent and neutral way for his or her high-quality self-development. As for the stupidity that accompanies religious faith, which, however, also occurs among those of other faiths than religion and sects, this stupidity is more or less always associated with a domineering touch. And this stupidity, which is undoubtedly the case when the inner and outer nature of human beings expresses domination, power, and a desire to be more than others, creates malice, enmity, degeneration of power, and Gewalt, whereby these factors arise just as inevitably from faith as the delusion of faith itself. Religious faith does not simply remain such for itself, but, as soon as it is accepted, it develops a compelling violence that leads to delusion, which has such an encroaching effect on the consciousness of human beings that their thought-feeling world very quickly becomes so clouded and infatuated that they immediately fall prey to a reality-truth blindness and thus to delusion of faith. And if this happens, then the human being is no longer able to free himself from it and falls prey to the fear that he would be punished by a god, etc., for giving up his faith, and this in addition to the fact that he is constantly pestered subliminally, and without noticing it, by his delusion of faith, so that under all circumstances he cannot detach himself from it and free himself from it. Every small or great stupidity creates in human beings a domineering or power-seeking, many-sided behavior, and this has the property of making itself recognizable to the outside world through one or more domineering attitudes and behavior patterns. This habitus in relation to leadership in an army, in any people, in a party, in a grouping, in politics or in the family, as well as in a government, religion, or sect, leads to uncompromisingness and to stubbornly following the rules, as well as to dictatorship-like, or even real dictatorship. As a result, regulations, self-importance, and rules, as well as paragraphs, ordinances, and laws, etc., are enforced without restraint, bossily, and without regard for losses. Many human beings who are only weakly aware of their self-education in terms of understanding, reason, and intelligentum, and have only halfway or not at all acquired self-education and general education, and therefore also go through life poor in understanding, reason, and intelligentum, as a rule fall prey to a religious or sectarian delusion of faith and become dependent on it in every conceivable respect, or even become slaves to the God preachers who misinform them. The stupid, and that is the bulk of earthly humanity, do not concern themselves with learning reality and its truth, just as they also do not concern themselves with self and self-evolution in order to really become themselves. This is not done by a stupid human being who has not educated himself in terms of intellect, reason, and intelligentum, as well as in terms of knowledge, wisdom, and general education. And this includes many of the upper and top elites who exercise their primitive might in higher and higher places and harass not only their subordinates but also the people whom they should not lead but guide in righteousness and true humanity. But the majority of the people, in their stupidity, are in bondage to the stupid of the elites and acclaim them in their high and highest positions, who know how to elevate themselves as powerful over the people and direct them according to their will. The majority of the stupid people of humanity are therefore attached to and in bondage to those stupid people who, as powerful people of the upper and highest leadership elites, determine the fates of their stupid people in bondage to them, whereby they also muzzle the few righteous people, who of course also exist in the elites and strive for true and good governmental righteousness for the people, suppress them and do not accept their efforts. And this is very easy for them because they are always the majority in all elite positions and thus in the superiority. And the fact that they cheat the people through and run secret governmental machinations about which the people are not informed, and in addition mendaciously claim that democracy prevails because the stupid people are in bondage to the elites and are allowed to vote for them with strong political influence, is not realized by the stupid majority of the people, and indeed not by any people around the world. Unfortunately, among all the states on Earth, only Switzerland is an exception in this respect, which effectively has a democratic form of government. And even if it is only a semi-democracy, there is still a higher and real form of democracy through which the people can determine a great deal and not simply the government. But of which, unfortunately, it must also be said that in this various rivets are wrongly active and, with regard to the EU dictatorship, blue-eyed and, moreover, stupid. And such elements can be found in various parties, which are also represented in the government, like those elements and parts of the people who fantasize a good future in the European Union dictatorship. A dictatorship with which ignorant lunatics and dimwits flirt as simple fools and consciencelessly want to betray and sell their own homeland to a dictatorship, ruled by dictators and dictatoresses who, if it were for their personal benefit, would consciencelessly strangle their own mother and their own children. A human being who has not fallen prey to stupidity stands upright and firm in life with both feet of his own, is content, peaceful, joyful and humorous, righteous and just, but which he could only attain because he has thus protected himself from stupidity by beginning to learn a certain time after his birth, and has created for himself a steadily growing and ever-expanding intellect, as in the same way also a clear reason and an intelligentum, which place him far outside the majority of all stupid people. Such a human being, who is also aware of his fellow human beings, of nature and its fauna and flora, and who does all that is necessary, which is personally possible for him, for their welfare and treatment, consequently does not simply pass them by carelessly and indifferently, or anything else. Such a human being also never strives for domination, for might and leadership, but is always only advising, helping, instructing, guiding, and leading the way according to his own good behavior, modestly and caringly. Stupid human beings can be defined as poor in their lack of imagination. For their lack of imagination, their lack of ideas and their inability to think abstractly cause them to sink into insensibility, as well as into coldness of thought and feeling, instinctlessness, indifference, tactlessness, and effective inability to live. A human being who, as a result of his failure to learn intellect, reason and intelligentum, is addicted to stupidity, is uncreative, humorless, and unoriginal. Just as he is unable to empathize with other human beings in thought and feeling due to his lack of sensitivity, and is consequently pitiless, inconsiderate, and intolerant towards them. On the other hand, however, a stupid human being, be he stupid in a small, minor, or major way, is prone to fanaticism, obedience, and excessive enthusiasm with regard to religion, sectarianism, politics, and also sports practiced by others, as has already been mentioned. But stupid human beings are also degenerate in thought-feeling with regard to idolizing and exalting persons, especially believers in religions and sects who worship, adore, and hail their deities, saints, and gurus of all kinds. But there are also the stupid ones who hail and exalt others for their achievements and deeds, but who are themselves completely incapable of achieving anything worth mentioning, as has already been said. But there are also the stupid ones who adore dictators, politicians, kings and emperors, singers and actors to the point of self-sacrifice and allow themselves to be killed for them, and also for their fanaticism and delusion of faith. In repetition, it must be said once again that stupidity is not innate and thus not genetically acquired at birth, for the way in which it is created lies with the human being himself, because stupidity works everywhere and comes to the fore in every human being who, through the upbringing of his parents, siblings, grandparents, fellow human beings, and through the various schools and also through his very own self-education, does not endeavor to develop his own intellect, his reason, and his intelligentum. And the fact that the majority of Earth humans, which also includes the majority of the upper and highest leadership elites of the nations, with very few exceptions, acts irresponsibly in this way and learns nothing or only little of understanding, reason, and intelligentum, is paid for by all Earth humans at a very high price, because the entire Earth humans are being educated by the upper and highest elites of the governments and their vassals, as well as by the religious fanaticism of the religions and sects and their gurus and other leaderships indoctrinating the believing people with religious imbecility, leading them into wars, uprisings, terror, assassinations, ruin and destruction, exploiting them, sexually abusing them, and in many ways restricting their peace as well as their freedom and fulfillment of life. For human beings, there are numerous causes why they act stupidly, whereby these result from actions, deeds, behavior, carelessness, unkindness, hatred, falsehood, greed, as well as thought, feeling, psychic movements, and many other factors. So, in every case, stupid actions are, without exception, purely self-initiated, self-made and self-executed stupidities, for the execution and making of which some personal elements are brought up, which, strictly speaking, are lacking in intellect, unreasonable and unintelligent, and therefore form the corresponding causes, which inevitably lead to stupid actions. So in this respect too, understanding, reason and intelligentum come into effect, or rather the opposite. At every moment when a stupid action is committed, a stupid situation is created, a stupid speech is made, a belief or anything else is used or done that is not thought through and handled with reason and intelligentum. The fact is, as already explained, that human beings must acquire the use of understanding, reason and intelligentum themselves from birth and cannot inherit their logical use. And if they act stupidly, it is because they only learn more or less laxly, and thus do not acquire sufficient understanding, reason, and intelligentum. So it is also completely wrong to assume that in the course of hominization an innate part of understanding, reason and intelligentum has developed in human beings, but that this would simply not be sufficient, because there is a certain innate lack of intelligentum from the ground up, and above all the lack of imagination is important in order to awaken intelligentum. And the confused doctrine that various, partly also gender-bound talents are not sufficiently available to the necessary extent, and consequently cannot be acted upon in a purposeful and situation-appropriate manner, is nothing other than ridiculous, because fundamentally all factors are determined solely by the conscious learning of the human beings themselves. Basically, he alone determines his own learning efforts, and the level of his intellect, his reason, and his intelligentum. And this also answers the question of the measure of the maximum and optimal human intelligentum as well as its limits, because these lie in the conscious possible maximum and optimal thinking, reasoning, researching and fathoming of real reality and its truth, whereby the maximum and optimal as well as their limits are determined by the human being himself by the extent to which he consciously and through learning endeavors to advance his thought, feeling, psyche, mind, reasoning, intelligentum, conception, conditioned searching, researching, and fathoming. And this must be done consciously and unswervingly from early childhood and adolescence and also in adulthood, as well as during the whole of life. And this must be done first of all through early and later education and training, in order to learn through it, and also in adolescence through personal self-education, which must be continued and then maintained throughout life. Thus, the human being alone determines the maximum and optimum as well as the limits and the measure in relation to his personal learning of intellect, reason, and intelligentum. The fact is that human beings must be able to enjoy a clear, clean, just education free from religions, sects, philosophies, and worldviews. If, however, such factors of faith are introduced into education, then the development of understanding, reason, and intelligentum is not promoted, but completely suppressed or malformed. And this happens through false parents, grandparents, schools, faith communities, religions, sects, secret co-parents, as well as friends, traditions, philosophies, media, literature, and worldly institutions. Furthermore, scientific institutions, private, social, and military academies should also be mentioned, as well as all kinds of secret cult institutions, colleges, organizations and universities, etc., which indoctrinate their followers, but also children and juveniles, members, pupils, learners and students with false teachings or purely hypothetical nonsense far from any real reality and truth. Everywhere there is a lack of real, truthful enlightenment, instruction and education, so that the necessary educational task is not fulfilled, but, on the contrary, the human beings are led astray by nonsensical and unrealistic false teachings. And this happens because in every conceivable respect, no method of education and no teaching institution does justice to the effectively necessary teaching of the real truthful conduct of life. The reason for which is that the necessary knowledge is lacking everywhere. The public media also play an important role in this, for instead of them taking up the correct and correct teaching of the conduct of life in an instructive manner, and spreading it in an instructive manner, as it should be learned by human beings according to reality and its truth. Only murder and manslaughter, politics, religion and sectarianism, the military, war, advertising, crime, and terrorism are reported on, which often has the result that human beings are thereby animated and become addicted to the propagated things, etc., emulate them, and become copycats. And this happens because, due to all the false teachings, human beings are incapable of creating understanding, reason and intelligentum, and are consequently incapable of grasping even simple, let alone very complex correlations and foreseeing long-term consequences of their actions and behavior. This, however, has nothing to do with an ability in terms of an imaginative faculty, as psychology erroneously misleads us that imagination is the crucial point, that it is only through imagination that thinking ahead and the development of cognition and learning, etc., are possible. Basically, this psychology assertion corresponds to sheer idiocy, because every thinking ahead and development of cognition and learning is founded in a correspondingly acquired measure of knowledge and its essence, wisdom. Through these values, understanding, reason, and intelligentum are developed, and through these, in turn, the ability to combine specially recognized reality truthful facts, through which probability calculations, or an ability to calculate in advance can be created, and thus foresight can be brought about. If, however, the necessary knowledge of the real psychological connections is lacking, as is the case on a large scale with the earthly experts in psychology, although they think that they have swallowed psychology wisdom en masse from gigantic automatic feeders, then even an ignorant monkey knows that nothing clever in the way of explanations and teachings can come out of it. Contrary to the stupid assertions and false teachings of earthly psychology, etc., human beings do not lack the imagination to imagine the consequences of their stupid actions, but effectively because, as a result of wrong upbringing and wrong teaching, etc., they do not develop their intellect, reason, and intelligentum to a sufficient degree. And in this consequence, the emotions and motivations also come into play, which are created by thoughts and feelings, and which, seen against intellect, reason, and intelligentum, are not only brought to bear inadequately over a longer period of time, but effectively cause the human being to act stupidly. And this happens because, due to the lack of his decisive abilities of intellect, reason, and intelligence, he can neither move in attention, nor can he master and control himself. This is due to the fact that he is not fully awake, present, and not up to date in terms of consciousness, as a result of which he is inevitably unconsciously subject to various cognitive deceptions, which often cause him to make stupid wrong decisions, and he suffers damage. Particularly in difficult problems of any kind, but especially in the conduct of life, the human being needs the clarity of his entire cognitive ability, or the totality of all processes that are connected with the perception and recognition of reality and its truth. However, this cognitive totality can only function if a clear mind, a valuable reason, and the decisive intelligentum are present and can be brought to bear. But if this is not the case, because these high values have not been learned, have not been worked out, or have been crippled and bewitched by false education and false teachings, understanding, reason, and intelligentum are subject to hair-raising results. First and foremost, there is a religious delusion of faith, which also goes hand in hand with the idolization of gurus, sect leaders, sages, and other spiritualities, as well as with the delusion of spiritual beings, angels, saints, and of a devil and his companions, who, in the sweat of their brow, fire the poor soul furnace in hell with coal so that the poor souls who have lived fallibly in life can be roasted in agony, whereby this imbecility haunts many delusional minds. Secondly, there is the lust for power and domination, which is also accompanied by a desire for prestige and immodesty, as everything is also accompanied by a desire to show oneself off, to present oneself as a very important person, but is also a very incompetent person. Thirdly, possessiveness comes to the fore in terms of possessions, money, and wealth. Finally, it is to be said that the training of consciousness and the resulting knowledge and the following wisdom must take place solely according to reality and its incontrovertible truth, and there must be no religious or other delusional influences. Only absolute reality leads to the perception and realization of real reality and truth, and through this to inner balance, contentment, and freedom, to peace and righteousness. On the contrary, all religious and sectarian faith leads to the urge for some nonsensical fantasies, and inevitably to illusions, and to bondage and delusion of faith, which altogether cause fears of faith, inner dissatisfaction, lack of freedom, hatred and vindictiveness, as well as retaliation and deeply impaired judgment, and many other evils and disadvantages. Every delusion of faith, like stupidity, produces a lack of judgment, as well as an inertia and sluggishness of apprehension with regard to real reality and its absolute truth. Religious faith and stupidity correspond to a disease of consciousness, which also creates a serious slowness with regard to the ability to combine the available facts. As a result, also, the effective real reality and its incontrovertible truth are not perceived, not recognized, not understood, and consequently cannot be implemented and comprehended. In addition, through faith and stupidity, further causes influence the function of understanding, reason, and intelligentum, and limit their energy and power, whereby these factors lie in the area of the emotions created and stored through thoughts and feelings. In the case of religiously believing and stupid human beings, these influence their overall cognitive processes at every opportunity, whereby first and foremost a rejection of perception with regard to reality and truth is forced, but on an emotional basis also a dependence and effective bondage to the delusion of faith arises, which as a rule cannot be countered with any strength with regard to understanding, reason, and intelligentum. Consequently, there is also emotional resistance against any realities and insights, as a result of which religious, sectarian, or other religionists such as gurus, priests, clergy, and cult leaders, etc. have a very easy game with their indoctrinations and manipulations with stupid and thus also faith-prone human beings, in order to convince them of all delusion and unrealistic reality and truth alienation. The total cognitive processes are unfortunately only used in an extremely unvaluable way by the majority of the total earthly population, because this majority of earthly humanity is not accessible to intellect, reason, and intelligentum, and this is so on the one hand due to the lack of necessary efforts with regard to conscious learning, and on the other hand because there is a complete ignorance with regard to the corresponding teaching, as this is given by the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life. In fact, only a small percentage, that is to say a minority, of the entire Earth humans and their rulers as the upper and highest elites are capable of effectively using the total cognitive processes and their values consciously, correctly and successfully. And this cognitively good, correct and successful working on itself and itself in logical, that is to say, and this minority, which is working on itself cognitively well, correctly and successfully, and which is building up its own intellect, reason and intelligentum in a logical manner, and which must inevitably turn away from the stupid majority and cannot struggle with them, is unfortunately being harassed by those who are ruled by stupidity and cannot implement and achieve the good and correct things that would be of need and benefit for the whole people. And because stupidity dominates the majority of humanity through the delusion of faith caused by religions, philosophies, and worldviews, any logical progress is prevented, as well as any wise coping with real facts with regard to the perception of the unchangeable reality and its incontrovertible and non-manipulable truth. Every act of profound stupidity and religious as well as sectarian delusion of faith strangles every hint of understanding, reason, and intelligentum in the delusional human being, before also only the possibility is offered of even directly reaching an open ear of the delusional human being. Nothing can be changed or altered about this, unless the human being, possessed by and in bondage to the delusion of faith, himself comes across some reality truth factor in a compelling way that frightens him and throws him completely off his path of faith. And only through this, or in some similar way, does it raise doubts in him about his religious or sectarian delusion, and thereby cause him to search for effective reality and its incontrovertible truth, in order to then consciously turn to it in a learning manner when he has perceived and found it. And this is the solved riddle of the minority of those human beings who, far from any religious delusion, lead a healthy and normal life in worldly existence and are concerned with a good, healthy, and correct way of life, as well as with personal mental development. It is this minority of life-affirming human beings who are in themselves contented, joyful, glad, peaceful, righteous, and just, as they themselves have consciously and willingly learnt to be by their own impulse and interest, and by personal knowledge, or by instructions of the time-honored teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, as this was created and taught by the herald Nocodemian ages ago, but which is also given today and is taught and disseminated as spiritual teaching, and in many books and small writings by the Figu. If the majority of the human beings on earth are observed with regard to their efforts to think, then it is frighteningly evident that they have a hellish fear of their own thinking and of their own thoughts and feelings, which is much greater and more powerful than anything evil and sinister that exists on earth. Even one's own death and the possible loss of one's own fortune is much less frightening to the majority of humanity than thinking that they could sin and be punished by God if they were to deviate unintentionally from what He, God, supposedly demands of them. So the majority of the human beings on earth consider their thinking and thoughts to be revolutionary and therefore subversive and destructive to their way of life and well-being. For each individual person of the majority of earthly human beings, personal thinking and precisely with it his world of thoughts is a terrible threat as a result of his delusion of faith. Because thinking itself knows no mercy and, regardless of any threat, simply forms thoughts which under certain circumstances can be completely different from what they are intended to be. So thoughts know neither mercy nor privilege because they correspond to habits and act like institutions that function according to certain rules, as a result of which thoughts can arise that, as I said, are not wanted but are anarchistic, reckless, heretical, lawless, and indifferent to all the imaginary wisdom and love of an imaginary God. Seen in this way, the human being of earth sees himself as a tiny, weak grain in the face of the stupid imaginary laws and recommendations of the imaginary God, which can do nothing but cover himself in profound silence so as not to harbor a false thought against the imaginary demands of his equally imaginary God. Therefore, in his fear of the alleged threats of his imaginary God, he shrouds himself in silence so as not to cause him to punish him. So he lags behind effective reality and its truth with his thinking, and simply lets them be as they are without caring about them. In this way he holds himself up proudly, remains unmoved by reality and truth, and imagines himself to be good, clever, and even a creation himself. In fact, stupidity is also involved in all this. But it inevitably means that the human being cannot bring himself under control because, as a result of his lack of education with regard to his intellect, his reason, and his intelligentum, he cannot bring himself to think and reflect, and therefore also to make the correct decision. Consequently, He becomes a slave to those who are able to think little and establish themselves as the upper or highest elite of politics, governments, and the economy, but first and foremost of religions and sects. Thinking is great, free and fast, and it is the non plus ultra or nec plus ultra, the no more and no beyond of the human beings of earth, by which he means that he has reached the highest of his glory. Therefore, the simple and stupid human being of the majority of the human beings of the earth does it in the same way as the leading specimens of the upper and highest government elites, as well as the religionists, gurus, priests, parsons, preachers and sect chiefs, as well as all dictators, many doctors, professors, money bosses, other big VIP specimens and big mouths, etc., who simply banish every thought and every thought far into the driest desert. The elites and the rich, as a result of their religious faith and their stupidity, do not want to think out of fear because they believe that thoughts could bring them harm, as is also the case with the normal, stupid people of the majority of humanity. All of them, however, all the stupid ones of the majority of humanity, let their thinking atrophy more and more for fear of losing their goods and their fortune. And since they are also afraid of their evil morals becoming public knowledge, they are stressed by this, as well as by the fact that all their possessions could be endangered by war, crime, and terror, and they could become poorer than a desert mouse. This also makes them envious, because they suspect that the next person will steal everything from them, and that they cannot do anything about it. And this again leads to prejudices that the next person could be a thief and a cheat, etc. But the fact that all this also comes about through thinking and dark thoughts is overlooked, and the whole thing is simply buried in the shadowy realm of oblivion. However, those human beings who belong to the minority of the non-grow of the stupid, and who are not addicted to a religious delusion of faith, want to prevent their thinking and thoughts by lies, slander, missionary indoctrination, and aggressive attempts at persuasion. And in this respect, especially the religious delusionists and the religionists, gurus and cult leaders of all kinds and types are in the forefront, stupidly and verbally or violently disregarding the free thinking of those who want nothing to do with the stupidity of religious delusion. For them, real and effective reality and its truth are a catastrophe, because reality and truth represent a might that, in the long run, can destroy every religious delusion if the delusionists find the way to reality. Truth. But this wants and is to be prevented by the delusion of faith under all circumstances, whereby in this respect all religionists of all religions and sects in their soul-launching paths around the world vehemently insult reality and truth in the same way, and try with lies and deceit to hold back their religious delusionists of their religion or sect. And this is practiced in every alleged place of worship, such as in Christianity in every church, in Islam in every mosque, masjid, that is to say, masjid place of prostration, in Buddhism in every pagoda addendum, pinyin tav, stupa thupa, stupiye, tope, chedi, chorten, dagoba, pagoda, and paya, etc. In Judaism in every synagogue, that is to say, bet Knesset sign, house of assembly, house of prayer, and skola, and in Hinduism in every temple, mandira sign, house of a deity. And with this I have once said what I actually wanted to clarify a long time ago, whereby to the whole that I have brought up in my monologue, as a conclusion, the following sheet also fits exactly, which Achim Wolf beamed to me a long time ago.
The more religious a human being is, the more he believes. The more he believes, the less he thinks. The less he thinks, the more stupid he is. The more stupid he is, the easier he can be dominated. This applies to cult members as well as to the followers of the great world religions with violently intolerant truth claims. In the long run, only enlightenment can help against this. Adolf Hull. If this is your God, he is not very impressive. He has mental problems. He is so insecure that he wants to be worshipped 7 days a week. He creates human beings with faults and condemns them for them, and he has people of other faiths killed because he is afraid of them. He is a pretty poor example of a supreme being. Leonard Nimoy alias Mr. Spock, found and sent in by Aachen Wolf, Germany.
Of course, you are not such as the really stupid Earth humans want to make you out to be, which is what you were talking about before your long monologue. For those are to be judged as stupid who are without education, and in their stupidity try to bring up something against you which does not correspond to the truth. Therefore, allow me to remark for once that among the bulk of all the stupid people who senselessly populate the earth and are incapable of recognizing their stupidity and stopping their slow but sure stultification, there also belongs the glore-rich, little void and puny library worker, as you call him, from Zurich, who, together with your ex and her youngest son, viciously denigrates you worldwide through lies and slander.
Ptaah, my friend, I am not used to such words from you, by which I especially mean the safe dumbing down.
You are right, but I have long since realized that your use of terms and ways of speaking are more correct in describing many things than I am in using my own way of speaking and words that do not express so precisely what is actually to be expressed. Therefore, I will make an effort to use your vocabulary from now on, because I think that it will also help me to be more precise in my opinion. But what I have to say is not about that, but I have to reveal something explanatory, which should open the eyes of your adversaries for once, as you are wont to say in such and other situations. And indeed, it is the only way that through once spoken open words also your adversaries shall finally recognize, insofar as their intellect and reason and intelligentum are sufficient for this, which I doubt. However, despite my hope that as a result of their confused faith and their stupidity-induced bondage to your then-wife, they themselves have become and continue to become liars, deceivers, and slanderers. And this is indeed the case, on the one hand, by unquestioningly accepting your ex-wife's lies, deceptions, and slander as true, and on the other hand, because they also continue to spread them themselves. This also applies to all your adversaries who, in a personal way, accuse you of lies and deceit through their spitefulness, know-it-all attitude, and envy. And they do this believing the lies and slander of your ex-wife, for which she alone is responsible and vindictively bent on discriminating against you. Their mind is filled with hatred and strives, as I have personally fathomed, to make you impossible in public through inaccurate, false, confused, and lying statements as well as slanderous allegations. And in this way she thinks and acts to damage your reputation and standing, but also to undermine and damage your work and defame your morals, behavior, and actions. They also seek to degrade you as a person and also to demean and belittle your achievements. However, the way your ex-wife thinks and acts, all those who believe her lies and slander and are in bondage to her do likewise, as well as all those who have raised themselves to be your adversaries and will continue to do so. Following this, they do the same as all others and your former hateful wife herself, namely by spreading deliberately premeditated, hostile, malicious and wantonly false and maliciously imagined accusations to accuse you and your mission, your pictures and films of our flying apparatuses as fraud and lies, as well as to defame and discriminate against you, and also our contacts and conversations, which are maliciously portrayed as pure inventions of lies. Hence, derogatory speeches are made against you, which are intended to depreciatively cut off your honor, whereby you are also to be trodden in the mud by the whole public, degraded, belittled, put in a bad light, and to enter the memory of earth humans as a bad liar and deceiver. Therefore, your ex-wife and all believers who are in bondage to her and all other adversaries will try with all possible means to discredit you and bring you into disrepute, to put you in a bad light, to put evil things down to you and to make you despicable in a slanderous way. And the purpose of this is to defamingly question your morals, as well as your mentality and thus the valuable qualities of your thinking, acting, behavior, and way of life, etc., among the general public. And this should be done in order to lose the trust of your close family members and persons who are still friends with you, as well as of the core group and passive group members. And on the other hand, through lies, slander, and underhandedness. The trust in you is to be destroyed among neighbors and fellow human beings in the immediate and wider surroundings, as well as in the general public, also among human beings interested in your work, whereby you are to become a disreputable person worldwide and contact with you is to be avoided in general. Therefore, your former wife works in such a way, as also her believers indoctrinated by her do to denigrate and discredit you with lies, slander and vituperation everywhere where you can be dragged through the mud and smeared, put down, devalued, and blackened.
Man, you have really got something with your new way of speaking. My compliments, my friend.
You are a good teacher, but it is really necessary for you to put yourself into the necessary, to write down everything and also to make it public what I have said and further still explain, whereby, moreover, it is desired and recommended by all of us that you finally also publicly disseminate something of what corresponds to the background facts with regard to the public lying and slanderous facts by which you are denigrated. It should finally be made clear to the public that such human beings, who against all reality and truth appear against you as liars and slanderers, are nothing more than pathetic, stupid, and character-damaged elements, whose intellect, reason, and intelligentum show the most serious deficiencies. And this is so, even if they want to give themselves the appearance of being educated and clever to the outside world, or even if they carry academic titles by which, however, they reveal all the more their stupidity and inability to form their own reasonable opinions and make their own decisions. It is also to be said that the origin and cornerstone of the whole thing is to be defined as compulsive pathological lying, and thus anchored in an uncontrolled antisocial personality disorder, which is why no remorse is caused in the originator. But this lack of conscience also occurs in the lies and slander of all imitators who, in their incapacity with regard to their own reflections, their false formation of opinion, self-decision, and their false behavior, unhesitatingly fall prey to faith as well as unthinkingly to the fantastic pseudologically fantasized lies, deceit, and slander of the lying and slandering originator and accept everything as truth. This, however, corresponds to the clear fact that these human beings suffer from a serious lack of intellect, reason, and intelligentum. But what is to be explained with regard to the encounter between Calliope and me is based on the fact that she was not able to come to terms with our meeting in the living room. And this is also because through our encounter she suddenly became terribly clear and aware that your contacts with us Playerin are reality. She often doubted this, although she was able to observe my daughter Simyase's flying apparatus several times and also hear its loud noises, as was also possible for other core group members and other persons who were allowed to be present at demonstrations, etc. at that time. Our meeting in the living room also made it clear to her that we will always stand helpfully behind you, which caused her problems because she also became aware that we knew very well that she was constantly lying to you and deceiving you. Just as her articles, with all their statements, explanations, and explanations praising you only corresponded to well-considered and purposeful lies and hypocrisies. She may have thought up these articles herself, but she did not draft or write them herself, because at that time she had only a poor command of the German language, both verbally and in writing. She then asked Christina, etc., to write the corresponding articles for the Aquarian magazine. Christina, in particular, held you and your attitude and your whole behavior in high esteem. Consequently, she composed and wrote everything herself according to her own sense, assuming that Calliope was also of the same sense, although in truth this was exactly the opposite. However, in your wife's false assumption that she could hide her true mind and dishonest actions from you, she felt safe and also confided her true intentions to Martin Sorde and his friend Mara, also handing over partially burnt slides to the man, which had been caused by the carelessness of Mrs. G, whom you psychologically cared for at the request of the municipal administration and the social worker from T, and restored her confidence in life. I know that she bumped into the table in your workroom and unintentionally pushed down the slides lying on it, which fell into the glowing oven and were singed, but which you were still able to take out of the smoldering coal before the final burning. About which, however, Calliope fabricated lies in the way that she had observed you burning bad, falsified slides. These singed slides, which you had saved from the fire, however, she stole from you, which is why you could no longer find them when you wanted to give them to Professor, who was interested in them. She then gave these singed slides to Martin Sorge, who, as a photographer, could still use them and produced photo forgeries with them, which he then used for a calendar. But she did not know that my daughter Simyase and also Quetzal and I kept you informed about everything. But you still behaved fairly towards her, kept silent, pretended to be ignorant and never let on anything, which was not easy for you, and to which I want to say that we all respected you particularly much in this respect. I also agreed that if we had had to be in your place, we could not possibly have understood all your behavior. Everything required your great experience of life, for without it the whole thing would also have been impossible for you. Even today, the three of us, when we come back to these events again and again, cannot explain how you were able to get through and cope with everything. And you were able to do so, although in the end, and already at the center, you were so psychologically devastated by all their malice and deceitfulness, lies and slander, that you only stayed alive through an extremely quick reaction and movement of Ava's hand. After which the intervention of my daughter Simyase also did what was necessary for you to regain your power. But if I now say something again about the encounter between Calliope and me, it is that through our meeting in the living room she saw her skins swimming away. As you once said, because it is still to be said that she constantly cherished thoughts of gaining financial wealth through you and thus of being able to become very wealthy. But during all the years of your marriage, she was not able to understand why you had no interest in wealth and also never will have. Because since your juveniles, it was never in your mind to accumulate financial wealth in order to lead a rich life. So your honesty was also repugnant to her, and therefore also your actions in the relationship. That you were not only very well versed in financial values, but were also thrifty and, moreover, honestly used all the financial means you received in the correct way and did not pursue any personal enrichment. She did not know that you had put up your own financial means for the establishment of the center, for the realization of the mission and for the production of the books, etc., and thus the majority of all financial expenses. Just as she also did not appreciate that you wanted to make an effort for the education of the children. That is why she always attacked you viciously, not only verbally but also physically and very dangerously on several occasions, when you wanted to take care of the upbringing, as a result of which she alone had the power over it, and miseducated her own extremely poor experience in this respect, which then also took its revenge and led to two of the children being indoctrinated in such a way that they became attached to her and separated themselves from you, and today go their dubious ways far away from you. In a very pleasing way, however, your son Atlantis Socrates, after long years of severe dejection and problems, has found his way into life, enjoys together with his wife a good marriage, a generally healthy independence, formation of opinion and conduct, as well as with regard to righteous behavior. This is particularly astonishing after all that he had to endure as a result of the wrong upbringing in his juveniles, for it took a great deal of reappraisal, energy and strength for him to become what he is capable of doing today in his attitude and behavior, in the formation of his opinions, in his interests, and in his decisions and actions, etc. And in this respect, as in other things, I cannot help but say that the longer, the more he seems to me like the image of your person, and that is something that pleases me very much. And when I think of that—
Thanks, Ptaah. Excuse me if I interrupt you, because I somehow just cannot help but say something. Namely that it is also for me a great, even huge joy, and much more. In fact, it is so that I did not dare to hope that, well, I am very grateful that everything has turned out so well, and so happily. All the evil and vile, all the lies, slander, and everything else bad of my ex, I have completely digested and forgotten for some time now, and I have had a tremendously valuable support for this from Ava in particular, which I can quite openly shout out into the world if it must be that all that you have said must be an official public necessity.
You interrupted me, but I can sympathize with what moves you, which I can also understand very well. But I wanted to say the following, and when I think of how tirelessly you went along despite your health problems, but nevertheless, in addition to all the nasty troubles, you took on many heavy tasks and did them in a manual and also in a written way, then this was more than just amazing. You also needed a lot of knowledge of various crafts, which you had to acquire during your life, as my father Svath had advised you to do, which you also wisely began in your early youth and continued in all the following years, as a result of which it became possible for you to do what you have just done, namely to build up the center, whereby you did the main work in terms of craftsmanship and knowledge and—
That's good, my friend, that's enough, because I also have to say a word about that, because I was not the only one who did the work. Many others also used their strength and worked hard, even if they were not skilled and not trained in the trades, and could only help by doing odd jobs. But through all their help, they all learned a lot and also helped me immensely so that the center could be built. If I had not had all their help, I would have been completely lost, just as the plan to build the center would have fallen through and could not have been realized. And honestly, I have to say that my ex, despite all the terror she directed against me and almost drove me to my death, also worked and achieved a lot, as did everyone else. First and foremost Elsie Moser. Jacobus, Bernadette, Engelbert, Hans Benz, and Marcel Hurt, but also Olgi Walder, Dorrit Strobel, Margaret Rose, Margaret Flammer, Claire Frey, and many others who unfortunately died or left. Of all of them, unfortunately only Jacobus and Bernadette are still alive, and that in the center, except for Olgi in Zurich. Although at the age of 93 and with their severe walking difficulties, they are only in contact with us in the center in writing and by telephone, and therefore can no longer come here. The two Schutzbach brothers were also very helpful in setting up the center, as were also Margaret, Renato, Maria and Mitcho, Dr. Fraud, Dr. Meyer, as well as various others later on, and Madeleine, Silvano, Freddy and Hans-Georg, Filia, Stefan, Gunther, Andrea and Wolfgang, etc., who did very valuable work. And as far as written work is concerned, there have also been various persons who have been helpful to me, especially in answering letters, which in the early years numbered several thousand, but which I was unable to do because of my manual work. Consequently, some secret helpers from outside took over the letter answering from me, but I was not allowed to talk about it, because no one was allowed to know about it. Not even our group members, especially because of my ex-wife, because it was to be feared that this action would have led to mischief, as your daughter Simyase had explained. That was also the reason why I was not allowed to say anything to the group members either. The silence also had to be because there were some well-known persons among them, but they have all died in the meantime, which is why today I can openly mention some names, but still have to conceal others. So I can only mention a few that I am allowed to, such as Wendell Stevens, who answered the letters for the USA, also Reverend, whom I got to know during my time as a trade representative and often had long conversations with him, where he was fully on my side and made an effort to answer the letters that came from religious people. It was also the same with Pastor Professor Burnett. Margaret Rufer and Lou Zinstag also made an effort to answer letters, as did Physics Professor. Today, Marianne Willinger works outside the center mainly for correction work, as well as for the production of writing, etc., as do passive members who write articles, although many also come to the center and lend a hand with various tasks. But to do justice to my ex, which you mentioned, I also have to say that my dear ex was really completely taken aback by her encounter with you. With the help of someone, she also wrote a short article about your encounter and talked about it again and again for months, because she was somehow completely taken aback by the encounter with you. But that changed when she got involved with my various adversaries. The chief cult preacher from Ruti, the magazine critic from Basel, the fraudster from Ticino who misused my photos for supposedly his own observations, etc., as well as the guy from the USA, etc., and all this because she was able to push herself into the foreground and present herself pompously with lies and slander in newspapers, magazines, and on television. And I was also able to convince my until then dear friend Herbert R. from Munich to enmity against me through lies and deceit. But how he could become a slave to her, he also still visits her at her place of residence in Thurgau, is a mystery to me, because he was often present when contacts were made, etc., after he had seen, experienced, and learned for himself that everything was above board. Well, in any case, she suddenly denied everything and described your encounter as a hallucination. But she could not cope with the whole thing, because for about 3 or 4 months, she kept waking up in the night and talking in her sleep about your encounter in the living room. Obviously, your encounter had sunk in quite deeply for her, and after 2 or 3 months, her behavior changed more and more and became visibly more spiteful, more false, and more malicious. And then she began to accuse me publicly in a slanderous way of fraud and deceit concerning my photos and our contacts. And this has continued ever since, especially after the divorce, whereby for some time now, it may already be 2 years ago now, she has also been spreading hatred and lies on the internet with the glue, a rich bookkeeper, who is full of hate, because neither you nor I respond to his conceits regarding Darwin and co., but reveal that the latter was a fraud and filed monkey bones in order to prove that human beings were descended from monkeys. And when she then cowardly ran away, after she had also had our 2 sons put into homes behind my back, I filed for divorce. Of course, she could not cope with that, so in her hatred of me, which she harbored because I had found out about her various irregularities and lies, she spread her slander uninhibitedly, increasingly and more mendaciously, with the help of her billy enemies lying at her feet, etc., all over the world via Mysteries Magazine, TV programs, and the internet. I also want to say something about the building of the center and the work done, and I cannot say this enough, because everything could only come about because all the core group members and passive members worked very diligently and pulled together in every respect and gave their best. And this was true of all the women and men without exception, because without their tremendous commitment, the whole process of building the center and building the mission would never have succeeded. And it must also be said that practically all those who had worked on the entire construction and the mission with regard to the manual and administrative work, as well as all other work, had no or only little knowledge or experience, but nevertheless always gave their best. And this is still the case today, even though everything has become easier and there is no longer so much heavy work to be done as there was during the construction phase. Although there is still a lot of work to be done today, which is likely to remain the case, it is no longer as strenuous as it was during the many years of the construction phase. But the fact that it is no longer like it was then does not mean that the workload has become less. Because now that we are already active worldwide and FIGU groups exist in various countries, the written and verbal work and everything related to it is growing more and more. And because we do not have enough core group members who could cooperate on the one hand, and who also need to have certain qualifications for certain tasks on the other, it is up to the few of us to do more and more work, whereby our women in particular are the ones who suffer, if I may say so. This is precisely because the women, especially Eva, Bernadette, Barbara, Daniela, Elizabeth, Madeline, as well as our 2 Karen and also Bridget, are the only ones who have the necessary qualifications to do all the work required for the completion of the main tasks relating to bookkeeping, typing, looking after the feathered fowl, cooking, gardening, housekeeping, preparing the post, correction work, correspondence, and various other things. Unfortunately, we only have Marianne away from home, but she also has a lot to do with correction work. Of course, all the men are also responsible for certain tasks and work according to their abilities, such as in relation to forestry management, printing work, environmental maintenance, garden preparation, renovation and maintenance work, computer work, some correction work, feather flock enclosure and feather flock care, etc., etc.
It is very busy all around, I know. But it is also admirable how you few persons manage to do everything. Because if everything is considered that corresponds to your tasks, then it is much more than your short lists suggest. And while you keep quiet about it, W.
Please not again, because it...
Good, but it should be said.
No, I do not agree with that. So I would like to talk about something else now, and first ask a question about the precedent diagram. Namely, have you found out what this term means and where it comes from or who created it?
Florina and Anjana, after their return, tried to find out the originator of the term precedence diagram and what it means. Their efforts have revealed that this term is a description of project management for management consultancies, etc. And according to their research, the originator is said to be a university professor, doctor, and engineer, Christopher Mark Schlick. But this cannot be said with absolute certainty. Indeed, it was possible that this man had only used the term in a public manner, but that the authorship was otherwise.
Thanks, also to the two girls, but I will tell them myself. But then I want to bring the speech back to something else, namely that you recently said that those responsible for the state in the EU dictatorship, Germany and the USA, are working underground to continue to portray Russia as an evil state, as well as to denigrate Putin as an evil man and disturber of the peace. This is precisely in the hope of provoking Putin into rash actions and evoking a mood of war. This new agitation against Russia, and thus, of course, above all, against Putin, is a long-standing phenomenon in the Western states, and it is the result of a completely idiotic, groundless hostility towards Russia that originates solely in the Western states. Can you say something about that?
Also, what is happening again with regard to the agitation against Russia, and which is being deviously directed by the Western states to provoke Russia, and thus, of course, Putin, to the point of extremely serious imprudence, is based on finding a reason to use weapons and thus to be able to start a war. This is about the hegemonic behavior of the EU dictatorship as well as that of the United States of America, whereby certain leaders of Germany also want to get involved, who, like the government strata of the USA and the EU dictatorship, are under the delusion that they have to dominate many states and even the whole earth. And when unwise state leaders and peoples reach out to the EU dictatorship to do so, they commit treason against their homeland, lose it at the same moment to the dictatorship, and are politically annexed. Especially the large territorial Russia with its resources plays the most important role, because if this could be brought into their possession by the Western states, namely through annexation and thus through armed conflicts, acts of war and underhand Secret Service activities, etc., then the entire West would profit and the whole of Russia would be flooded with Western immigrants and exploited. Such plans have secretly existed in Germany from time immemorial and were also carried over by the early emigrants to early America, where they have been secretly perpetuated ever since and are constantly used to denigrate Russia, to make her out to be the enemy and to malignantly incite the Western peoples against Russia. This, however, has always created hatred against Russia in the Western populations, whereby they were deliberately misled by those in power, which in the Nazi Empire also led to the Russian campaign, which fortunately failed, and also because this meant that the USA was also unable to implement its plans to dominate Russia in reality. Nevertheless, the United States of America and Germany, as well as the EU dictatorship and its vassal states influenced by it and under its thumb, will not rest and will continue to maintain their hostility towards Russia and will continue to try and do everything to provoke Russia and bring it to a big war. Their old established hatred and enmity and greed for the territories of Russia are deep-rooted and will also cause much mischief in the future. This is what I want to say in short words to your question.
Then something else. Again, a new attempt is being made to force the Swiss population into a new weapons law, about which you have said something that should actually also be mentioned in a public conversation. I am referring to your explanation of the background to the new attempt by the EU dictatorship to restrict the possession and purchase of weapons in the private sector in Switzerland, whereby all the Swiss who are scared shitless cannot think ahead in their stupidity to what the EU dictatorship is trying to achieve. These stupid people, who exist not only among the people but also in the government, actually think that stricter gun laws, according to the EU dictatorship in Switzerland, would lead to fewer crimes being committed with firearms, which could not be more illusory. This crazy thought and this crazy statement alone prove that the persons who think this kind of nonsense are incapable of judging things and problems. Under certain circumstances, this can still be halfway understood by certain people among the common people, because they are not educated enough. But the fact that such people are also functioning in the government, who obviously lack the necessary education in terms of understanding, reason, and intelligentum, which clearly shows the level of stupidity and unreasonableness, is extremely alarming. This is precisely because these people are called by the people to govern themselves in the country, which they quite obviously cannot do.
Then I will come back to this and expose the true background that lurks in everything. Firstly, it is to be said that the leadership of the EU dictatorship, which I call leadership because Nazi-like traits were already shown in its creation, is steadily developing more and more in a Nazi-like manner in the present time. However, the fact that those who are responsible for the state and the people of Switzerland, who naively want to integrate their homeland into the EU dictatorship, are already bordering on betrayal of their homeland and its peace, freedom, and neutrality. Also, certain treaties with the dictatorship, stupidly and irresponsibly as well as insufficiently considered, concluded by Swiss state representatives, are not compatible with Switzerland's neutrality, but put it under duress to fulfill the dictatorship's demands. And this coercion is based on the threat that the Schengen Treaty will be terminated for Switzerland, which offers some advantages for Switzerland, its population and economy, etc., but which is also deviously drafted in such a way that Switzerland will have to bind itself more and more to the dictatorship and lose more and more of its independence if new demands for dictatorship coercion keep breaking in on Switzerland. Even at the beginning of the Schengen Treaty, Switzerland recognized and signed the treaty, even though those responsible were incapable of understanding the real meaning of individual underhand clauses. And this also happened in the respect that, from the beginning of the negotiations, the Lisbon Treaty was also not consulted and not taken into account, by which the death penalty was again established in the treaty, which in the end, if Switzerland, through stupidity and irresponsibility on the part of those responsible for the state, becomes more and more contractually entangled in the coercive demands of the EU dictatorship and loses its state autonomy. And this will happen if Switzerland continues to submit to the subterranean terror-like Gewalt and coercive demands of the ever-new and ever more coercively binding Switzerland into the EU dictatorship yoke. With regard to the EU dictatorship itself, it is already the case that it is visibly developing in a way that was peculiar to the Nazi Empire. But this is obviously not perceivable by all those EU rejoicers of the EU supporters in Switzerland, who are limited in consciousness, ignorant and inferior in terms of intelligentum, and therefore stupid and also naive. And unfortunately, these ignorant people are not alone, because there are also ignorant persons in the direct government circles whose intellect, reason, and intelligentum are not so developed that they would recognize the real facts and insidiousness of the EU dictatorship. So they also do not realize that the dictatorship's intention is to finally include Switzerland, which until now has still been free. but which is no longer completely independent, but which is already under the EU dictatorship's thumb through partly unfair agreements, through the stupidity of the Swiss supporters of both sexes. And this is because the supporters are incapable of seeing through the underhanded machinations of the EU dictators who, by constantly introducing new laws and regulations, etc., are increasingly restricting the rights of the states and their populations, as has also happened with the new weapons law, and is being accepted unthinkingly by all those incapable of thought and consideration, as we have fathomed before. And with regard to these and other restrictions, there are already subterranean and insidious ambitions of the EU dictatorship to curtail the universal Declaration of Human Rights established on the 10th of December 1948 by the General Assembly of the United Nations with regard to freedom of opinion and expression, and ultimately to dissolve it completely. In this respect, the idea is that the peoples should not be allowed to rise up verbally against the EU dictators, but should be punished in case of violation, up to the accusation of treason, which should then be punished with the death penalty decided in Lisbon. And should this secret planning, which already exists in certain minds, actually come about, then a disaster of unparalleled proportions will result from it. The new weapons law referred to is surreptitiously intended to be only a further step for later and new demands, which in the future are to be directed more and more towards finally and surreptitiously completely disarming the entire peoples of Europe in their private sphere. This is clear, on the one hand as a result of the cowardly fear of the dictatorial EU leadership that the peoples might rise up and take armed action against individual ones of them, but on the other hand in order to ensure that no persons, groups, and organizations, etc., could carry out armed attacks against the EU dictatorship leadership itself. This is because the dictatorship leadership rightly fears that uprisings and rebellions could arise from the population and that the dictators could be attacked and killed, although this is already threatening not only in their direct sphere, but also with regard to the leaderships of the EU dictatorship member states, because in their populations there is already an increasingly widespread discontent that will degenerate. And this discontent, which has been spreading among the populations for some time now, on the one hand in the dictatorship, but on the other hand also against the leaders of their own countries, and which is becoming stronger and stronger, is fueling hatred against those in power, and will ultimately lead to acts of murder and destruction. And that this is true will be proven in the near future, for which I will mention 2 or 3 events that will take place in Europe, as we have investigated. So it will come about that in Germany, the first politician will be shot, and also the whole German party and government system will be thrown into turmoil and hatred, and the like will arise among the party members, as in former times. There will also be changes of leadership, but rebellion and discontent as well as unrest will increase far and wide in the populations and cause more and more hatred, which will not only affect the governments but also people of other faiths, such as believers in Jews and Islam, but also the masses of refugees from the southern countries. And these will be met with particular hatred when it becomes known that most of them were wealthy in their home countries and had to pay large sums of money to those who helped them to flee, so that, as a rule, only the wealthy were able to finance their flight and will continue to be able to do so, whereby the German Chancellor, in her lack of conscience, is responsible for the whole refugee disaster. It is also to be said that in Europe there are also government overthrows, as will be built up and brought about in Austria in the near future due to intrigue. But discontent and hatred against the government leaders will also break out in other states and bring them into turmoil, which will also lead to many deaths among the population and security forces in the coming times. Now I have to talk about the EU dictatorship again, because I have to mention that there are already secret, but not yet finalized plans to build an EU dictatorship army, against which, however, the dictatorship peoples could offer armed resistance if this should become reality. However, such resistance is now to be nipped in the bud by the fact that the populations of all states belonging to the EU dictatorship are to be banned from the private possession of weapons by the new weapons law in the course of the coming period through increasingly restrictive laws and measures. This is out of fear that if weapons were to remain in private possession, it would have to be feared that EU enemies from the EU dictatorship citizenships, emerging as lone fighters or as groups or organizations, would take action against this EU army. The demands in the new Weapons Act correspond in the long run to just as well-directed and insidious underhanded measures, which are to be realized in the course of time for the benefit of the EU dictatorship, as also the so-called Framework Treaty with Switzerland. However, the fact that those responsible in the states that have to decide on these matters are absolutely incapable of grasping the effective facts in a far-sighted manner is demonstrated by all their wrong decisions and misjudgments, which are causing more and more restrictions on freedom for the populations of all states. The proposal that weapons in the possession of private individuals should be banned, therefore, has on the one hand the aforementioned background. But on the other hand, it is also claimed and lied about that a ban on weapons is intended to bring crime and crimes with weapons to a standstill. Such a weapons ban, as also demanded by Switzerland, which is not a member of the EU but by the EU dictatorship, and which will be put to the vote in this way, cannot be supported in any way. Only the Swiss population itself could create a good and expedient regulation for its own country by means of an electoral provision, and only in such a way that, on the one hand, each person himself voluntarily accepts a renunciation of any weapon if he has no need of one. A reason for owning a weapon as a collector's item or as a souvenir for any understandable reason should be laid down by law and allowed to persons of integrity, while the purchase of weapons should also only be allowed to persons of absolute integrity if they can be shown to be neither criminal, psychopathic, nor morally, emotionally, or otherwise unpredictable. Consequently, a logical solution should be sought with regard to the private possession of weapons, and not a general ban on weapons should be imposed. This is not at all in the manner of the EU dictatorship, which wants to demand a general ban on weapons for the peoples in order to secure absolute rule over its affiliated peoples by means of its own army, which is envisaged later. If these peoples, if they consent to the criminal ban on weapons demand of the EU dictatorship, could lose all independent rights of possession of weapons also with regard to their own state. This will also threaten Switzerland if the fools of the responsible rulers, as well as the fools of the Swiss people, who adhere to the EU dictatorship and live under the delusion that EU membership would be advantageous for Switzerland, do not change their minds, which, on the contrary, would ultimately lead to great horror. And the fact that Switzerland, as a free and neutral state, has so far entered into binding contractual obligations with the EU dictatorship at all, is not only incomprehensible and criminally stupid and naive, but also dangerous for the continued existence of Switzerland in terms of its independence, freedom, internal and external peace, and the right to make its own decisions and act on its own behalf. Another inescapable factor of a private weapons ban would inevitably be that both privately by righteous persons, but especially by criminals and violent criminals, more illegal weapons would be sought and acquired, whereby inevitably also an uncontrollable and flourishing criminal black market trade would come about, and mischief would result. This, in addition to other unpleasantness which such a weapons ban would cause, as such a ban is demanded by stupid persons in Switzerland who are very much inferior in intellect, reason, and intelligentum, because in their naivety, in their lack of understanding, and in their incapacity of a personally far-sighted prudence and far-sightedness, they are just as absolutely incapable as well of a clear thinking and logical thinking and judgment of an important matter.
Exactly. That's what you said harshly in our conversation, even though all the stupid and naive feel offended by it. Precisely because they are stupid and naive and, therefore, do not want to accept the truth of your explanations, and will call us offensive and unjust because their intelligentum as well as their intellect and reason are not sufficient to grasp reality and its truth.
That will unquestionably be so.